Today's conversation, the question of marriage as a civil and human right, will begin with a presentation by Dr. Kelly Kramer, Professor of Peace Studies. We will then have Q&A afterwards. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kelly Kramer to this forum.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm a little short for this podium, but I've been tripping over my skirt all day, so I'm going to stay here rather than walk around. Thank you all for coming. Some of you may remember back in 2007, former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger said, "I think that gay marriage is something that should be between a man and a woman." Okay. Whatever else we may believe, I think we can all agree that this is sometimes a confusing or complicated issue. So my goal today is to help you make an informed choice when voting this November by increasing your knowledge of the human rights issues surrounding the proposed amendment to the Minnesota Constitution. The amendment would, I'm sure by now you're all familiar, but I'll say it again just for those who may have been too busy with other things up until this third part of the series. The amendment would recognize marriage as solely between a man and a woman. Just to preview what I'm going to talk about so you can follow along more easily, I'm going to start by explaining a little bit about what exactly human rights are, because most people have them, but they're not sure where they come from or how they got them or how they might get them enforced should they need to. Then I'll continue by reviewing the status of same-sex marriage under international human rights law and in practice. Those are not always the same thing. I'll briefly examine the relationship between the right to marriage and the right to freedom of religion, which is another right that some people feel is at stake, and it gets kind of interesting when you look at it. And then finally, we'll take a brief look at the actual proposed amendment itself, the text of the amendment, and what the ballot will look like. And then I'll do a quick recap of how this fits in with the overall question of human and civil rights. I think the main thing I want to call to your attention is that marriage itself is a universal human right. However, human rights law does not currently specifically address same-sex marriages. So there are no international treaties or customs that guarantee the right for same-sex couples to marry, nor are there international treaties or customs that prevent them from marrying. And we'll see in a little bit that when it comes to looking internationally from country to country, things vary widely. So to start with the question, what are human rights? Let me make sure I've got my mouse ready to go here. I don't usually like PowerPoint, but since some of this is going to be phrasing in legal documents, it's helpful to put things up in front of people. This is not legal phrasing, but I want to unpack this definition that comes from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, just to help you see that human rights, while very straightforward, are also not so straightforward. So taking the parts of the definition from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy that are relevant for our concerns today, human rights are international norms that help to protect all people everywhere from severe political, legal, and social abuses. These rights exist in morality and in law, and they are addressed primarily to governments requiring compliance and enforcement. And you can see by the ellipses I've actually taken some less relevant things out, and yet it's still quite long and complicated. So to unpack briefly, when we say that human rights are international norms, that generally means more or less that they're agreed upon standards, that the international community has come to see certain things as rights that belong to people by virtue of being human, right? Which means if you're born human, then these rights are yours. Of course, it gets a little more complicated as we start digging into it. They're meant to help protect all people everywhere from severe political, legal, and social abuses. And this universal nature, which in a moment we'll take a closer look at, this universal nature of human rights should make them quite simple, right? You write a document or two, legal documents spelling out what people's rights are, you make sure they're legally enforceable, and boom, you're done. It turns out that as human rights have evolved since they first started emerging, really as legal norms since World War II, certain groups of people have needed special protection, usually groups that have been vulnerable, that have been discriminated against, mistreated, abused, and all the things these rights are intended to protect you from. And so if you start examining human rights documents, you'll find a Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, there's a Convention on the Rights of Children, and so on and so forth. Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So it gets more complicated than just being a norm that everyone's agreed to, that all people have the right to. These rights exist in morality and in law. Again, this is adding a complication, right? What do we mean by in morality? Usually these rights exist and are debated on various grounds of philosophy, of religion, of what people consider to be justice or injustice. And then in law, when there's enough agreement at the international level, you may actually get a treaty or a convention, sometimes a declaration, which doesn't have the status of law but is a step towards making rights enforceable. Keeping in mind, of course, that international law is pretty darn hard to enforce at any time, right? United Nations is not a government, it does not have a military, right? So the rights exist in morality and law, you have them since you're born, but sometimes they're, I might say, honored in the breach, right? And you start to realize that you might have a right only when somebody's been violating it, right? And sometimes in quite horrifying ways. Then finally, these rights are addressed primarily to governments, requiring compliance and enforcement. And that's where it gets really tricky, because governments, even with the United Nations, maintain their sovereignty. That means governments have the final say in what they do or don't do. And we'll take a closer look at that when we start looking at human rights as they apply in the United States and in Minnesota. So basically, human rights are international, first codified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed by the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1948. And I wanted to mention that human rights are distinct from civil rights. Right? Civil rights are the rights of citizens within a state. And so you may have human rights as a human being, which may or may not then be enforced in practice with the civil law of your country. Right? Different countries have different laws that they, or different rights that they choose to enshrine in law. And in fact, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when it came time to turn it into international law, we ended up with two separate conventions: the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights and the International Convention on Cultural, Economic, and Social Rights. And I never get the name of that one quite right, but that's an approximation. One of the main reasons we ended up with two separate conventions is that they were put together during the time of the Cold War. Right? Civil and political rights are the type advocated most strongly by the United States. Economic and social rights advocated most strongly by the Soviet Union. Right? But I digress. So just to say, as you start trying to turn these things into law, it gets complicated. It gets more complicated when you try to get countries to sign on. For our purposes today, I'm going to stick with the Declaration, even though it doesn't have the force of law. When it comes to the question of marriage, the right to marriage and the right to religion, both of those would be turned into law through the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, which has more legalistic language, but doesn't deviate far enough from this to make a difference. So I'll stick with the more straightforward document. And if you ever want to see the text of this, to figure out exactly what rights you have in the world, all you have to do is Google UDHR or copy down the URL I have up there at the top. Before I get to the right to marriage, I want to briefly discuss this idea of universality. Human rights are meant to be universal and belong to everybody. So we're going to take a look at the parts of the Declaration that codify this. Right? In Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Right? All human beings, no exceptions. Article 2, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, and there follows a list. Keep in mind this was 1948, so for our concerns today, sexual orientation doesn't show up on the list. However, there is this, I've highlighted in red just to help you follow along, down at the bottom. They left an ambiguous category called other status, so that even the declaration itself can evolve as our understanding of what rights people have and what categories people fit into might change. Right? Things never stay static with human beings. Law would be much easier, I think, if they did. But Article 7, all are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. Right? This includes equal protection against any discrimination in violation of the Declaration and also incitement to discrimination, which I've always found kind of interesting. It's hard enough to protect against discrimination. To try and enforce any sort of action against incitement to discrimination can get, again, quite complicated. And then finally, Article 28, everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. So we're back to everyone. So in terms of universality, those are the articles that help to define it. But I want to add that, of course, because this is complicated, not all rights are universal. Restrictions tend to be the exception that proves the rule, but we will see in the language of the right to marry that there is a restriction. Right? This is Article 16 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that codifies the right to marry, and it begins, men and women of full age without any limitation due to race, nationality, or religion have the right to marry and to found a family. Right? Now you'll notice the language for once does not say everyone. Right? It says men and women of full age. Right? And when you start to unpack it, you can see some rationale. Right? How many, raise your hand if you think that 2-year-olds should be free to marry if they so choose. Right? How about 6-year-olds? 10-year-olds? 14? 16? Maybe? 17? 18? Okay, a whole lot of hands go up. We have a room where there's pretty much consensus about what should be the age of consent for marriage. Does anybody know in Minnesota what the law says? I'm not good on Minnesota law, so. Anyway, this is a right that is restricted. Right? Clearly, in this case, it's restricted by age. There's also another restriction that marriage shall be entered into only with the free and full consent of the intending spouses. Right? No one can marry you against your will. No one can same-sex marry you against your will, should we determine at some point that there is a right to marriage for same-sex couples. Right? It can only be entered into with consent. So it's not universal. It requires consent and possibly has some ambiguous language. And I'm not a lawyer, so I won't play with this too much, but men and women have the right to marry, but it doesn't say each other. Right? It doesn't, on the other hand, say adults of full age. Right? So it's ambiguous language. Keep in mind this is 1948. I'm not sure if anybody was even using the term sexual orientation in 1948. But laws against homosexual activity were widespread internationally. There was not any widespread gay rights movement, so to speak of, and so on and so forth. So we're left with a document that doesn't specifically address same-sex marriage. And in fact, what you see here on the screen is a document that the United Nations published this year in 2012 titled Born Free and Equal, Same sexual orientation and gender identity in international human rights law. This is the first ever United Nations publication on GLBT rights, 2012. And what this document says with regard to the right to marry is, in fact, that under international human rights law, right, so that's the caveat at the beginning, that's the limitation. So when we're looking at international human rights law, legal documents, states are not required to allow same-sex couples to marry. Even so, the obligation to protect individuals from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation extends to ensuring that unmarried same-sex couples are treated in the same way and entitled to the same benefits as unmarried opposite-sex couples. So while the law does not address the question of same-sex marriage at this time, the equality and non-discrimination provisions of international law require equal treatment. This is, it's actually a very interesting publication that covers far more than marriage. Marriage is about a paragraph in a 60-page document. It looks at things like protecting people from homophobia, from violence based on sexual orientation, and a number of other pressing international issues. Right? So for the current status under international human rights law, there is no international treaty or custom, as I said earlier, that guarantees that right. There's nothing that bans same-sex marriage under international human rights law. What we have instead is an emerging issue area. Right? Same-sex marriage is now legal in 10 countries, as listed here. And I didn't put the dates on here, but one thing that's interesting to notice is that all of these laws have been passed since 2000. So when I say emerging issue of human rights, right, something is changing. How far it will go, it's hard to say at this point. But same-sex marriage was not a legal right anywhere until very recently. So it's legal in 10 countries. In the United States, it's been legalized in 6 states, unless there's something very, very recent that has changed. In Washington, D.C., and in 2 federally recognized native tribes, which I was unaware of before doing the research for this presentation. On the other hand, in at least 7 countries, engaging in homosexual acts is still potentially punishable by death. Okay. So when it comes to the question of the right to marriage, you can see where international conversations are beginning to happen. Individual countries the issue is contested in many individual countries, but as far as the globe as a whole, there's a wide-ranging disparity in terms of equality, non-discrimination, and definition of rights for LGBT people. Any questions so far? And I'm kind of trying to speed through this because I don't like to hear myself talk all that much. Jim? Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how that made it into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but you're raising a really important point, which is just because the rights are declared or even enshrined in law does not mean that they are enacted in every country. For example, one of the rights you have under international law is the right to adequate food. But you're not going to find that legal right anywhere in U.S. law. Right? It's not in the Bill of Rights, nor is the right to shelter, and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure actually the origin of that, but it might, my guess would be it might be one of those points the United States held up as an ideal, didn't want to be seen not holding up as an ideal, and knew that it would not have to enforce immediately in practice. Right, this would be at a point where Truman had integrated the military and the question of integration was starting to be on the table. But as far as being legal, your point is well taken. Any other questions? Okay, rolling right along then. I want to briefly touch on this question of, is there a conflict between the right to marry and the right to freedom of religion? Because that's been a great concern. Universal Declaration of Human Rights says everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief. Note again the 1948 language. It's his religion or belief. Don't worry, fellow women, we are included in practice, if not in pronouns. To change his religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. Where this becomes very interesting, at least from my perspective, is that different religions have different teaching, practices, worship, and observance with regard to this question. So there are churches and religions that say marriage is for man and a woman only. And there are other churches and other religions, other religious organizations. If you start investigating in Minnesota, you'll see all kinds of declarations on both sides from churches. There are others that want to be able to perform same-sex marriages and have them recognized by the state. This is actually part of how same-sex marriage became recognized in Canada. There was a church that was willing to perform services and found a loophole in the law and then claimed its right to freedom to practice religion. So in terms of, is there a conflict, the conflict could go in either direction. If religious groups are being forced to conform to a law that conflicts with their teaching and practices. I'll get to the United States in a minute. This has been kind of a complicating issue for some countries, for example, in England or in Great Britain, where they have the Church of England as the official state church. Should there be a national law saying that gays and lesbians have the right to marry, then the Church of England would be required as the state church to conform to that law, and it gets, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to try and unpack all the complications, but you can start to see if you're compelling a church to perform rites that are not consistent with its teaching and beliefs, right, then you will be infringing on the religious rights of the members of that church. It's also important to remember that it's human beings that have human rights and not institutions. So again, we're back to it's really complicated. In the United States, where we have some rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights, one of the rights we have says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Right. This is a way of ensuring that the laws do not conflict with anyone's religious practices. So in terms of human rights, as long as whatever's done with regard to this right to marriage is not compelling people to violate their own religious beliefs, then it would be consistent with at least this part of that right as established in law. Interestingly enough, in the United States, the right to marry is not anywhere in the Constitution. And to the best of my knowledge, really only makes one, and Jim, you can correct me if I get it wrong, one appearance in federal law under the Defense of Marriage Act. Would you know? Being in American politics?
There's no mention of marriage in power allocated.
Right, so it's not in the Constitution. Right, the Defense of Marriage Act is a federal law that says marriage can only be between a man and a woman, and also adds that states do not have to, I forget the exact language, but states do not have to respect marriages, same-sex marriages performed in other states if they do not conform to the law of the state itself, which may possibly be in conflict with the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution, that states have to, imagine the chaos if states never had to respect each other's laws. I know the Defense of Marriage Act is coming back up in front of the Supreme Court. I'm not actually in the session that starts today. But I don't want to stray too much further away from the question of human rights. Just to say, getting back to my point, that marriage laws belong to the states. States get to determine. And where this becomes interesting in terms of human rights is that Minnesota actually has, unlike the federal government, has a Department of Human Rights. And in fact, there's a Minnesota Human Rights Act that spells out, remember I was saying human rights are sometimes spelled out more clearly for groups that have been discriminated against. The Minnesota Human Rights Act has 13 so-called protected classes. And one of those protected classes is sexual orientation. It is illegal to discriminate against someone because they are or are thought to be gay, lesbian, straight, bisexual, or transgender. And this is taken from a publication on your rights under the Minnesota Human Rights Act from the Department of Human Rights website. So sexual orientation is a protected class, which means that discrimination is not allowed in any of these 7 protected areas: employment, housing, public accommodations, public service, education, business, and credit. And the reason I have public service highlighted in red is because in the examples of public service in the same document is included down there in red city, county, and state departments of health. Does anybody know why those would be relevant to this issue? It's the Department of Health that issues marriage licenses. However, like I said, this is always complicated. We also have a state law that prohibits certain kinds of marriages. Like you can't marry your cousin in Minnesota, which I did not know. But among the prohibited marriages are a marriage between persons of the same sex. Right? I understand there is some litigation on same-sex marriage being pursued in Minnesota. I don't know anything about it in any detail. I've only heard that most people don't think it will succeed. But so in terms of human rights, we have a document that protects human rights, including non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. We have a state law that says persons of the same sex may not marry. Everybody with me so far? So this is the actual text of the amendment. I took this from the Minnesota State Department website. The amendment that people will be voting on in November. What is proposed to be added to the Minnesota Constitution. Only a union of one man and one woman shall be valid or recognized as a marriage in Minnesota. And on your ballots, it will look like this. Right. The ballot question is, shall the Minnesota Constitution be amended to provide that only a union of one man and one woman shall be valid or recognized as a marriage in Minnesota? Most of you, if you've been to any of the earlier presentations in the series, will already know this, but I'll say it for those who might not be familiar with the meaning of these votes. A yes vote will alter the state constitution. It will amend it to restrict the right to marry to heterosexual couples only, right, one man and one woman. It will make that ban on same-sex marriage a little harder to change should people change their minds in the future, because it's harder to change the Constitution than it is to change a law. If I understand it correctly, a change after the Constitution has been amended would require another amendment, another ballot, another cruise through this whole process. Changing the law is slightly easier. That can be done, obviously, through the legislature and the governor. And as for the question of freedom of religion, the current ban on same-sex marriage means that those churches that wish to perform them do not have them recognized under state law. Yes, question, comment? Yes. Yeah, the requirement for passage of an amendment is something called a peculiar majority. I love the language. And peculiar majority means if you don't vote, it's assumed that, or it's counted as a no vote, because they're trying to make a higher hurdle for amending the Constitution. Right? You can't just count the yeses and nos. So when it comes time to vote, you have to think just as hard about not voting on the question, basically, for this one, as you would about whether to vote yes or no. So just really to recap, human rights are intended to be universal. Right? They are universal. You get them when you're born human. They protect people from mistreatment, or they're intended to protect people from mistreatment, especially by governments. Under current human rights law, all men and women have the right to marry, but there are no international laws requiring or banning same-sex marriage. That's international laws, so there's nothing at that level that countries are supposed to comply with. It leaves open the question of whether or not, and this is something to think about when you're voting, is there a moral right under the equal treatment and non-discrimination principles for same-sex couples to marry? A yes vote on the amendment will change the Constitution to ban same-sex marriage. A no vote leaves the Constitution unaltered, but the state law banning same-sex marriage will still be in place. And so voting no just means that you don't want the Constitution to be changed. And then if you don't vote, it will be counted as a no vote. To finish off, since I started out with a funny quote from Arnold Schwarzenegger, I really tried to find another funny same-sex marriage quote, but they all seem to be one-sided, and I'm supposed to be presenting to the degree that I can neutral information. But I never promised not to say something funny about my own views on marriage in general. So I'll just leave you with this lovely idea that I tend to agree with from Mae West, who said, "Marriage is a great institution, but I'm not ready for an institution." So, always good to have a laugh when we're having tough conversations. With that said, I guess I want to open things up for people to comment, to question. I really hope people will talk to each other rather than just back and forth to me. Should I stay up here? Or?
We'll use the microphone so that it can be recorded for the video recording here. If anybody has questions, I'll pass the mic around.
Shall not pass a law prohibiting the exercise of religion. Mm-hmm. Why is it that the federal government prohibited Mormons from engaging in polygamy in the 1800s? Isn't that a infringement on their exercise of religion?
I don't really know how that came about. I suppose it could be. That's a rather small religious group, so there might be possibility of... Do you have more information on this as a...
Technically, Utah was not a state at that point in time, and so
here we
what
go.
Congress said is that you cannot, that Utah could not enter the Union as a state unless it repealed its polygamy laws. So that's kind of like an end run around the fact that the Constitution doesn't actually give Congress the right to legislate because they were not actually a state at that point in time. Whether that's a good answer or a bad answer, that was what happened.
The government still, in Utah and other states, still enforce anti-polygamy laws, and they prosecute criminals, Mormons who have multiple wives.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone's litigated that. But it does uphold my point that human rights are oftentimes honored in the breach by governments.
All right, so then I have a question. You said that some churches in the state wanted to marry same-sex couples, so how come under the freedom of religion section there they aren't allowed to do that? Because wouldn't it make sense if they're able to exercise their religion and they want to marry same-sex couples, then shouldn't the government be forced to recognize that? I'm a little confused. So.
Yeah, the thing is, the way to do that would be through courts and litigation. And so far there hasn't been any successful litigation. And this is where politics comes back into play. And I am far from an expert on state of Minnesota politics and law. I'm much more comfortable at the international human rights level. But laws often get passed that then get challenged as being discriminatory. And if you think back, we'll go back to Jim's example of the laws banning interracial marriage. Those were on the books for a very long time and were challenged in various state courts, since marriage is a state-defined issue under the Constitution, and sometimes challenged with some degrees of success, sometimes unsuccessfully, until Loving versus Virginia, thank you. A case that made it up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found laws against interracial marriage to be unconstitutional. And so if Minnesota has a law that churches feel is infringing on their rights of religious freedom, part of the issue that becomes tricky with religious freedom, as I understand it, and if we have any lawyers in the room, please help me out, is that you could conceivably marry folks in your church according to your practices, and the issue would be whether or not the state recognizes it. Is it infringing on your freedom of religion for the state to not recognize that marriage? I don't know that anyone's actually litigated that one.
First I have a response just to a question that was asked back there of that, as far as polygamy, that no humans are, if I'm understanding correctly, that no humans are given the right to polygamy, whereas this is taking into account the fact that some humans have the right to marriage and other humans don't. So that's just what I was, marrying one person. But is that correct? I just wanted to state that.
That would certainly be an area that international human rights law has never addressed.
And then I had a question for you that I'm uneducated about the Department of Human Rights. And I was wondering, like, who makes up that department? Or, like, who wrote those documents that, like, when you gave the contradicting documents from the Department of Human Rights within Minnesota?
The Department of Human Rights, as I understand it, is governed by the Minnesota Human Rights Act, which is a state law. And then the marriage prohibition is governed by another state law. And the actual wedding licenses are not issued by the Department of Public Health. They're issued, I believe, at the county level. One of the things I noticed when I started researching how this is done in Minnesota is it's very complicated to get married. But the license itself is issued by the Department of Health. Like I said, most people that I've consulted or whose opinions I've seen in various media suggest that litigation on this issue is not likely to succeed, and that may have to do with the political climate as much as anything else. This is a state that's pretty politically divided on a lot of things. Did you have another comment or question? Or who was? Yeah. It's part of the state government. Well, the laws are made by the state legislature and then carried out by the various branches of the state government, depending on what the law is about. So kind of similar to at the federal level, where you have the Department of Defense, Department of State, so on and so forth.
Is there anything in universal human rights that considers the right to see a significant other in the hospital or that sort of thing? Because I know some of those rights that come along with the label marriage from the state government are what homosexual couples are concerned about as well. Is there anything in the international community that recognizes that?
Yeah, that would be back to the discussion in this first ever publication on GLBT rights, where it says, and I didn't put the whole quote up on the screen because by the time you've got enough words in a PowerPoint, people stop focusing on what it says. But it says, after it points out that under international human rights law, states are not required to marry same-sex couples, it goes on to say, even so, the obligation to protect individuals from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation extends to ensuring that unmarried same-sex couples are treated in the same way and entitled to the same benefits as unmarried opposite-sex couples. Right? So their interpretation, I think that's why they titled it Born Free and Equal. Throughout this publication, they highlight and this comes from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights at the United Nations. Throughout the publication, they highlight the equal protection and non-discrimination aspects of human rights. So this, for example, some countries don't allow same-sex marriage, and some states don't allow same-sex marriage, but allow civil unions or some marriage-like thing with a different name that then conveys the same benefits on same-sex couples.
Would the intent then be that they would have the same rights as common law marriages? So, for example, if an opposite-sex couple has been living together but never went through the hassle of getting the marriage license, but they are treated as though they are married in terms of hospitals and stuff like that. I've never heard of any same-sex couple, even if they've been together for 40 or 50 years, having that same recognition. But is that document really calling for that?
It's being an international political document, not clearly calling for any particular way of following that provision. One interesting thing I learned, again, in researching these issues is that Minnesota apparently does not recognize common law marriages, which I did not know. It's one of the ones listed under prohibited, I think, and if I'm remembering correctly, that's where I saw it, under prohibited marriages in Statute 513. But I think this is more loosely suggesting that, not an analogy to any particular, to common law or any particular other form of law, but that the rights must be respected in practice. And again, being from a UN document and not an actual law itself, it's suggesting the potential possibly under international human rights law that someone, again, could potentially litigate. But litigation of international human rights law is even far more difficult than litigation of state or federal law because, going back to what I said earlier, that countries have sovereignty, right? The government makes the final decisions, and the United States, in fact, has a history of ignoring judgments in international law that go against us because considered a violation of our sovereignty even when we've signed the relevant treaty. So I guess what I would say with regard to this, since this is an emerging area of contestation, shall we say, at the international level, the tendency over time has been for human rights to expand rather than to shrink. I can't offhand think of any human right that has ever been granted and then taken away. But the expansion comes through a lot of dialogue and struggle, oftentimes motivated by social movements, countered by other social movements. And so there's no guarantee in terms of what direction this might go in. But clearly, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights suggests that equal protection under the law and non-discrimination will be key factors as the conversation continues. Geez, I sound like a politician.
Hi. Could you go back to the document, the Declaration of Human Rights on the family page?
Marriage?
Yes, thank you. I saw the point number 3, and I wish we would talk about that just a little bit. That the family is a natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. I had no idea that any of this stuff was in international law, so this is really interesting to find out. And it seems to me that this is kind of a protection for, the question is, protection from what? You know what I'm saying? And the word about natural points to the key heart of the debate, in my perspective. And the question is this a human right? Right? That means if it's yes, then I'm all for gay marriage. I'm all for anything that's a human right. Absolutely. So if the United States can come to this consensus, yes, it is a human right, then sign me up. Yeah, I want to support that. But here's my perspective on it, and I know many people share this as well, is that it is not a human right, and that it goes against the natural order. And the international law kind of recognizes this with the natural and fundamental group unit of society. Protection, enshrinement, recognition that this is the Lego bricks. And if you change the Lego bricks, then society's changed. I don't think anybody can disagree that this will change society as a whole. This is really a huge question, and it's very important because it changes the direction. And from my perspective, that last point right there is the reason why to say yes to the amendment and preserve. It's not restricting anything. You're not taking away anything. The law already says, right? That law is what it is. Somebody said it earlier last time. It would just make it more illegal, right? So it's not like a restriction on anything. It's a protection of it. Protection. Thank you.
Kelly, is there any case law yet of nations respecting or not respecting marriages performed in other countries? On the equivalent of the full faith and credit type issues in the United States, is there any custom law? Is there anything under treaties? Is this completely open at this point?
So far as I know, it's up to the countries to decide. I know there has been some litigation of related issues in Europe. There was a case of a lesbian couple in France who wanted to adopt, and they claimed discrimination because France does not allow them to marry and does not allow unmarried couples to adopt. And the European Court, I believe it's called the Court of Human Rights, found that there was not a violation of human rights in this case. And this is very interesting because this gets misquoted a lot in the English language press. There is not a right to adopt, and in the context of that, part of what these women said was that it was discriminatory because they did not have the right to marry and so could not meet the qualification. However, the language in the decision, and so far I've only been able to find it online in French, but I have it with me if anybody reads French and wants to read it. The actual language of the decision, when it's reported in the English language press, it usually says the court found there's no same-sex couples do not have the right to marry. And they leave out the rest of what the decision says, which is under the European Convention of Human Rights, right, which is another document similar to what I've been discussing with the UDHR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It doesn't ban same-sex marriage, and it doesn't explicitly uphold it. It's not, the language isn't in the document at all. I don't know if that gets to what you're saying. But in Europe, it becomes an issue because presumably the members of the European Union would want to respect each other's laws the way states in the United States do. And some of them are now recognizing or have legalized same-sex marriage and others have not. Yeah, and presumably, and custom is a source of international human rights law, that becomes far more complicated when you start talking about customs because customs vary so widely around the world. For example, definitions of the family and ideas of what a natural family unit are historically have varied widely through time and space. But likewise, should there be enough recognition among European countries of one another's same-sex marriages, that might over time lead to a situation where then the laws would be changed, or should they start refusing to recognize? It could also lead to something similar to us having this amendment where the conversation has to happen more formally. To my knowledge, it's not really reached that level yet.
I just want to address the previous comment before Jim's in terms of number 3. The reading is that the family is a natural and fundamental group, not marriage. Now, it does come under the rubrics of 1 and 2, but again, marriage is not defined heterosexually in the 1 and 2. So the family is what is natural and fundamental group unit. So I don't see this as advocating that one type of marriage over another is a natural right.
So if there's still 10 countries who, or shouldn't say still, but if there's 10 countries who have made it legal for homosexual marriage, and if there's still 7 countries who, I think you said, punishable by death for homosexual acts, and you said how it's ultimately left up to the countries, I'm just wondering what type of authority is this universal document even have then? Or where does it get to some point where the United Nations can step in and say, hey, this is against human rights, or vice versa?
Yeah. Christy, you want to take this one? She does international. International law is extremely difficult to enforce. So
yeah, I mean, especially the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a non-enforceable document. It's a declaration. Nobody signed on to it per se. They passed it in the General Assembly, but it's not the same way you ratify a treaty, which the United States and other countries have done in the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. So no, I mean, there's nothing legally that, we live in an anarchical society as far as the international systems go. There's nothing the UN can do to say, states, you must behave in a particular way. The power and force that international norms have is that if enough people agree with a certain idea, then they can move forward and try to get an international treaty. And even if you get an international treaty, then states have to publicly, if they decide to sign on, they have to file reports. For example, under the ICCPR, states file periodic reports saying how they're complying with the law. Then they publicly have to say how they're complying with the law, right? But as of right now, that doesn't exist. It's something that I think there's maybe a small movement for in the international community. It's something that our Secretary of State has said that the United States supports greater protection for minority and gay rights around the world. But as of right now, people complain that international law doesn't have any force, and legally that's true. But it does provide a focal point for people to talk about what we value. And so in that way, I think, it still has some relevance. And certainly, even the states where homosexual activity is punishable by death, they don't, run around at the United Nations jumping up and down about that, right? Saying, yeah, isn't it good we stick it to the homosexuals? They don't do that, and that's because I think there is this kind of growing view of human dignity that would not make that acceptable. And so that's another way that international law has power, is it kind of works as a set of best practices that are then enforced by the individuals who agree with that norm. And eventually, sometimes people say, either for their own self-interest or because they change their minds, that we agree with that as well.
And oftentimes, international pressure can be used in a way that international law can't. So, for example, in Uganda, where there recently have been efforts to pass a law making homosexuality punishable by death, so far that has been held off by strong international pressure. Although a few months ago in the New York Times there was an article discussing how there was a building reaction in Uganda of people who wanted to pass the law because they were mad about the international pressure and thought it was countries unduly interfering in their own internal business. But had there not been that international pressure, I might have been standing here saying there are 8 countries that punish it. So there may be an emerging international consensus against the death penalty for acts of homosexuality, which is a very narrow, tiny step to take, but that may be one of the directions things are going in.
Could you bring up the slide of the religious freedoms again? So hypothetically...
Do you want the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, or the international? This one?
Yeah. So hypothetically, if same-sex marriage were legal in the state, this would not allow it, so no congregation would be forced to perform a same-sex marriage if it were against their beliefs.
Yeah, that's what, well, if you're looking at the United States, we'd want the Bill of Rights. The separation of church and state prohibits requiring churches to perform services against their beliefs. At least that's what every U.S. lawyer I've talked to has concluded. Does that get to your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, the international one gets more complicated because of states that have state churches.
I just wanted to add a comment to what Christy said about international law. In my mind, when international law is most effective is when it's incorporated into somebody's national law code. This is how the UN Conventions Against Torture, the Geneva Conventions Against Torture, the signatories of that have committed themselves to incorporate that into their own domestic law codes. So, because the nation itself has enforcement mechanisms that the United Nations doesn't have. So it sets a standard, but the enforcement is, in a sense, national enforcement.
Yeah. When human rights become civil rights and widespread civil rights, then they're much more enforceable.
Any other questions?
Kelly, those countries that do allow same-sex marriage, do you have any idea of how that got passed? Do they regard marriage as a right, a human right, and same-sex marriage respected under that? Was it a rights kind of debate?
I couldn't say for sure because it's been a different process in each country. I know in Argentina, they came up against strong opposition from the Catholic Church, but there was a widespread, I believe it was done through a popular vote in Argentina. Anybody familiar with the Argentinian case? It was, people are still surprised that Argentina has this law, but I believe it was just a matter of becoming popular enough to pass it through.
In the Argentinian case, it was brought up by a ballot initiative, so the populace voted on it. It was in strong opposition in the rural areas, but in huge acceptance in places like Buenos Aires, where the majority of the population resides.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Then let's thank Kelly for her great presentation today.